I'll tell you the story of how I went from being public enemy number one to having the best seat in the house for the most epic workplace meltdown in corporate history. They sabotaged me with the subtlety of a freight train, fired me with all the foresight of a goldfish, and then proceeded to faceplant so hard into their own consequences that I almost offered to help them up. Almost. Little did they know, firing me would spark a federal probe that turned their corporate empire into a house of cards. But to understand how spectacularly everything unraveled, you need to know how this whole mess started. You need to meet the person I was before they decided I was their problem. The Golden Retriever employee era. Picture this. I walked into that office every single morning like I was reporting for duty at the Justice League headquarters. My coffee mug might as well have been a cape because I treated every mundane corporate task like it was my personal mission to save the world. All my coworkers treated their jobs like jobs. I treated mine like I was starring in some inspirational workplace movie where the underdog changes everything through sheer determination and an alarming amount of overtime. I was that employee who actually read the company handbook, not just skimmed it during orientation, but genuinely studied it like it was sacred text. I was the only one who noticed every tiny handbook update. When they sent out company-wide emails about new initiatives, I was the only one who responded with detailed questions and suggestions for improvement. My inbox was a graveyard of corporate communications that I had not only read, but analyzed for ways to optimize our workflow. The irony is that my coworkers actually liked me. I wasn't some brown-nosing corporate climber trying to step on people to get ahead. I genuinely wanted everyone to succeed. If someone was struggling with their workload, I would stay late to help them catch up. If a new employee looked lost during their first week, I became their unofficial mentor and tour guide. I was basically the human equivalent of a golden retriever in business casual clothing. My desk was organized like a military operation. Color-coded files, labeled folders, a system for everything. I had backup plans for my backup plans. When other people's computers crashed and they lost important documents, I was the person who somehow had copies saved in 3 different locations. I treated our company database like it was my personal library, constantly updating information and fixing errors that had been sitting there for months. Every department meeting was like Christmas morning to me. I showed up with printed agendas, prepared questions, and sometimes even PowerPoint presentations that nobody had asked for. When management announced new company goals, I created personal action plans to help achieve them. I was essentially doing consulting work for free while getting paid entry-level wages, and I thought this was perfectly reasonable behavior. The thing about being aggressively competent in a mediocre environment is that it makes everyone else look bad by comparison. While my coworkers were content to do the bare minimum required to collect their paychecks, I was out there treating every task like it was a personal challenge to exceed expectations. I didn't realize that in many workplaces, exceeding expectations isn't seen as admirable dedication, but as an annoying disruption to the established order of comfortable mediocrity. I was completely blind to office politics. When people had hushed conversations that stopped when I approached, I assumed they were planning surprise birthday parties or discussing weekend plans. When certain managers would exchange meaningful looks during meetings, I thought they were just having one of those moments where colleagues are on the same wavelength. I interpreted passive-aggressive comments as constructive feedback and responded with genuine gratitude for their input. I was so out of touch with office gossip that when the GM's mugshot surfaced online, I still assumed he was a rockstar manager who just had a rough night. My performance reviews were consistently excellent, which only reinforced my belief that hard work and dedication were universally appreciated values. I received praise for my initiative, my reliability, my positive attitude, and my willingness to take on additional responsibilities. What I didn't understand was that this praise was coming from upper management who lived in a different universe from the middle managers who actually had to deal with my daily existence. I volunteered for projects that nobody else wanted. I stayed late to finish work that could have waited until tomorrow. I came in early to prepare for meetings that could have been emails. I treated every company event like it was a networking opportunity to build stronger relationships with my colleagues. I genuinely believed that if I just worked hard enough and cared enough, everyone would recognize my value and we would all succeed together in perfect workplace harmony. The most ridiculous part is that I actually thought my managers appreciated having someone so dedicated on their team. When they started assigning me increasingly difficult projects with impossible deadlines, I saw it as recognition of my capabilities rather than an attempt to set me up for failure. When they began excluding me from certain meetings or decision-making processes, I assumed they were trying to reduce my workload so I wouldn't get overwhelmed. Looking back, I realized I was like that overly enthusiastic student who reminds a teacher about homework assignments right before the bell rings. Technically doing the right thing, but making everyone else's life more difficult in the process. My genuine desire to excel had painted a target on my back the size of a billboard, and I was too busy perfecting my latest process improvement proposal to notice that the archers were taking aim. What I didn't realize was that my enthusiasm had caught the attention of some very specific people who were not impressed by my dedication. In fact, they were actively annoyed by it, and these people were about to become the architects of their own spectacular downfall. Meet the Bumbling villain squad? Let me introduce you to the masterminds behind this corporate catastrophe. First was the general manager, Harvey, whose hiring process apparently involved zero background checks, since his mugshot from a domestic abuse case was circulating online before he even finished his first week. Harvey had that special talent for making terrible decisions with absolute confidence, like he was following some kind of reverse leadership manual. Then there was the assistant manager, Captain Incompetence, who had somehow failed upward through the corporate ranks with impressive determination. He'd read buzzwords off a cheat sheet, then butcher every policy he tried to enforce, turning simple procedures into confusing disasters that left everyone more confused than when they started. The department supervisor, the ego, had been promoted to her level of incompetence about 5 years earlier and treated her minimal authority like she was running a small country. Her signature move was turning 5-minute conversations into hour-long meetings that accomplished absolutely nothing, while creating unnecessary paperwork she'd later complain about. Finally, there was the operations manager, Professor Chaos, who earned his nickname through his uncanny ability to create problems where none previously existed. He would schedule mandatory team-building exercises during the busiest part of the workday, then act genuinely confused when productivity dropped. These four formed what I can only describe as a perfect storm of managerial mediocrity. They held secret meetings in conference rooms with glass walls, apparently unaware that everyone could see them huddled together like they were planning the crime of the century. Their conspiratorial whispers were about as subtle as a marching band practicing in a library. They would stop talking whenever I walked by, which would have been suspicious if I wasn't so busy assuming the best about everyone's intentions. What made this situation particularly absurd was how threatened they felt by someone who was just trying to do their job well. My competence wasn't some calculated strategy to make them look bad. I wasn't gunning for their positions or trying to undermine their authority. I was literally just showing up and doing the work that needed to be done. But in their minds, my basic professionalism was apparently an existential threat to their carefully constructed empire of mediocrity. The ego was particularly bothered by the fact that other employees actually liked working with me. She had spent years cultivating relationships based on fear and micromanagement, so the concept of earning respect through competence was completely foreign to her. Captain Incompetence was threatened because I made his complete lack of useful skills painfully obvious by comparison. Professor Chaos was upset because my systematic approach to problem solving highlighted just how chaotic and ineffective his management style really was. Harvey just seemed annoyed that someone was making the rest of his team look competent by comparison. Their strategic planning sessions were legendary exercises in missing the point entirely. They would spend hours analyzing my work performance, looking for weaknesses that didn't exist, while completely ignoring actual problems that were affecting the entire department. They created elaborate theories about my motivations that were so far from reality they might as well have been fan fiction. According to their version of events, I was some kind of corporate spy sent to infiltrate their operation and report back to upper management about their various shortcomings. What made their eventual scheme so predictably disastrous was their complete inability to think more than one step ahead. They were so focused on getting rid of me that they never considered what might happen after they succeeded. They were like cartoon villains who spend so much time perfecting their elaborate death traps that they forget to have an escape plan. Their master strategy had all the sophistication of a middle school cafeteria plot and about the same chance of success. The most ridiculous part was how seriously they took themselves throughout this entire process. They acted like they were conducting some kind of covert intelligence operation instead of plotting against a coworker who brought homemade cookies to staff meetings. They treated their petty office politics like it was a matter of national security. Watching them try to be sneaky was like watching elephants attempt ballet. Their plan was brewing with all the subtlety of a volcanic eruption and about as much chance of ending well for anyone involved. They had convinced themselves that they were criminal masterminds executing the perfect frame job, when in reality they were more like the Three Stooges attempting corporate espionage. The beautiful irony was that in their determination to prove I was bad for the company, they were about to demonstrate just how catastrophically bad they were for everyone involved. What I didn't realize was that their brilliant scheme was already in motion, and I was about to become the unwitting star of the most obvious setup in corporate history, the art of corporate subtlety. Their sabotage campaign launched with all the subtlety of setting off fireworks in an empty theater. The ego kicked things off with what she probably considered a masterstroke of psychological warfare, cutting my hours. Instead of my usual 40 hours per week, I was suddenly getting 25 or 30. When I asked about it, she delivered this elaborate explanation about efficiency and labor costs, claiming this was actually beneficial for my work-life balance. I thanked her for looking out for my well-being, though it was interesting how this concern for my personal time never extended to offering me a pay raise to compensate for the lost income. When I asked if there was anything I could do to help optimize the schedule, she stared at me like I had just volunteered to solve world hunger with a calculator. Captain Incompetence took the exclusion approach, systematically cutting me out of important communications and then acting shocked when I didn't have information I couldn't possibly have known. He would send emails about schedule changes to everyone except me, then expressed genuine disappointment when I showed up at the wrong time. When I politely pointed out that I hadn't received the email, he would make this theatrical show of checking his sent folder and claim it must have been a technical error. This happened so frequently that my coworkers started forwarding me emails I should have received directly, which completely defeated his purpose. The three of them began holding what they apparently thought were covert strategy sessions right outside my work area. They would huddle together and whisper while glancing in my direction, seemingly convinced they were being inconspicuous. It was like watching middle schoolers plan a surprise party for someone they actually hated. Other employees started asking me what was going on with these little conferences. I genuinely had no idea, so I made up excuses about operational improvements and positive departmental changes. Their coordination efforts involved giving me contradictory instructions and then acting frustrated when I asked for clarification. The ego would tell me to handle something one way. Captain Incompetence would demand the exact opposite, and Professor Chaos would explain that both approaches were wrong. When I tried getting all three in the same room to discuss the conflicting directions, they acted like I was being difficult and making simple things complicated. I started documenting these conversations because I was genuinely confused about what they wanted. They escalated to nitpicking my work with obsessive dedication. The ego would review completed projects and manufacture problems that didn't exist, complaining my reports were too detailed or too thorough. Captain Incompetence would critique my communication style, suggesting I was being too direct or too polite depending on his mood. Professor Chaos questioned my decision-making, even when my decisions led to successful outcomes. I kept thanking them for their feedback and asking for specific suggestions to better meet their expectations. The situation reached peak absurdity when they started assigning me tasks clearly outside my job description, then criticizing me for lacking proper training or resources. They asked me to handle vendor negotiations requiring authorization I didn't have, then expressed disappointment when I couldn't close deals beyond my authority level. They assigned technical projects requiring specialized software we didn't own, then acted surprised when I couldn't produce professional results with basic office tools. I kept volunteering for additional training and requesting access to necessary resources, which seemed to annoy them even more. Other employees were starting to notice something weird was happening. Coworkers approached me privately asking if I had upset management somehow. They could see I was being treated differently, but couldn't figure out why. When I explained I was just as confused, they started sharing their own observations about the manager's behavior. Several people mentioned the three of them spending unusual amounts of time discussing my performance. I told them management was probably just trying to help me develop professionally. The most ridiculous incident happened when they tried writing me up for working overtime. I had stayed late to finish a project Captain Incompetence had assigned with a next day deadline, and apparently this was my fault for poor time management. When I pointed out the timeline had been set by management and I was meeting their expectations, they explained I should have prioritized better or asked for help. When I asked who I should have approached since they were all unavailable in meetings, they said I should have figured out a way to get their attention. I apologized for the misunderstanding and asked them to help me develop better time management strategies. Their pre-termination strategy involved questioning every decision I made and every process I followed, even established procedures that had been working effectively for months. They would demand I explain my reasoning for routine tasks like I was defending a doctoral thesis. When I provided detailed explanations, they suggested I was overthinking simple problems. When I simplified responses, they implied I wasn't being thorough enough. Looking back, I was like a cartoon character walking toward a clearly marked cliff while cheerfully waving at the people holding the dynamite. Everyone could see what was coming except me. I was too busy trying to be the perfect employee to notice I was about to step into the most obvious trap in workplace history. But their amateur hour conspiracy was about to graduate to something much more dramatic. The frame job of the century. The moment finally arrived when our three criminal masterminds decided to execute their brilliant plan. Picture this scene like something out of a heist movie, except instead of Danny Ocean and his crew, we had the corporate equivalent of the Three Stooges trying to pull off the crime of the century. They had been planning this setup for weeks, whispering in conference rooms and exchanging meaningful glances across the office like they were coordinating a bank robbery instead of trying to frame someone for allegedly taking home leftover food. The setup was so elaborate you would have thought they were trying to steal the crown jewels. Captain Incompetence had apparently spent days orchestrating this masterpiece of deception. The plan involved a canceled catering order that had been sitting in our kitchen for hours. Here's the beautiful part about their master plan. This canceled order was never on any official ticket, never documented anywhere, just sitting there like forgotten evidence they could manipulate however they wanted. One of the line cooks, who was apparently either in on the scheme or just tired of looking at the food, offered it to me as I was finishing my shift. In my typical fashion, I said thanks and took it home, thinking this was just normal workplace courtesy. What I didn't know was that this innocent interaction had been carefully observed and documented by our amateur detective squad. The next morning, they called me into the conference room with all the drama of a courtroom proceeding. The three of them were sitting there like they had just solved the mystery of who killed JFK. The ego had this folder in front of her that she kept tapping with her pen, as if it contained classified government secrets instead of whatever flimsy evidence they had managed to scrape together. Professor Chaos was leaning back in his chair with this smug expression that suggested he thought he was about to deliver the performance of a lifetime. Captain Incompetence looked like he was trying not to smile, which made him look more like someone with gas problems than someone who had just cracked a major case. They started the meeting by asking me about my previous day's activities, which seemed like an odd conversation starter, but I went along with it. I explained my tasks, my interactions with coworkers, and my general workflow, still assuming this was some kind of performance review or project debriefing. They listened with the intensity of federal investigators, taking notes and nodding seriously at information that was about as exciting as a grocery list. Then came the dramatic revelation. The ego cleared her throat, like she was about to deliver a presidential address, and announced they had reason to believe I had stolen company property. Captain Incompetence launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. We take theft very seriously here, and your actions yesterday was completely unacceptable and shows a lack of integrity that we cannot tolerate in this organization. The grammar was as mangled as their logic, but they delivered it with the conviction of prosecutors presenting a murder case. I actually laughed because I thought they were joking. The dead serious expressions on their faces quickly made me realize this was not a joke. When they explained that they were talking about the food from the canceled catering order, I tried to explain the situation, offering to speak with the line cook who had given me the food so we could clear up what was obviously a misunderstanding. But they weren't interested in hearing explanations or gathering additional information. They had already made up their minds about what had happened and were not open to alternative interpretations of the facts. The evidence they presented was so thin you could see through it with a magnifying glass. They had no witnesses to any actual theft. They had no video footage of me taking anything without permission. They had no documentation proving that the food was not supposed to be given away. Their entire case was based on the assumption that I had stolen something, combined with their apparent belief that their assumption was equivalent to established fact. It was like watching prosecutors try to build a murder case around the fact that someone had been seen holding a kitchen knife. I kept trying to reason with them, explaining that this was clearly a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a simple conversation. I offered to pay for the food if there had been some kind of policy violation. I suggested we could review the company handbook together to clarify what the actual rules were about leftover catering orders. Every suggestion I made was met with a kind of dismissive responses you might expect from people who had already written the ending to this story. As the meeting continued, I started to realize that this wasn't really about stolen food at all. The accusations were so ridiculous and their refusal to consider any reasonable explanations was so obvious that I began to understand what was actually happening. This was an excuse, not an investigation. They had already decided to fire me and were just going through the motions of justifying their decision. The canceled catering order was just convenient timing that allowed them to create a narrative that sounded official. What they didn't know was that my phone had been recording in my pocket the entire time, not because I had planned anything, but because I had accidentally started a voice memo earlier and forgotten to stop it. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things. I tried one last time to maintain my professional composure and suggest that we handle this situation in a way that would be fair to everyone involved. But they had already moved past the accusation phase and were heading straight toward the sentencing portion of their Kangaroo Court. The realization that I had been completely outmaneuvered was starting to sink in, even though I was still trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. The firing heard around the office. They were ready to deliver cleared her throat one final time and delivered the verdict with all the ceremony of a judge sentencing someone to life in prison. She announced that due to my violation of company policy regarding theft of company property, my employment was being terminated effective immediately. The way she said it, you would have thought she was announcing the successful conclusion of a major FBI investigation rather than firing someone over leftover sandwiches. Captain Incompetence nodded solemnly like he was witnessing some kind of historic moment in corporate justice. Professor Chaos actually had this little smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he was trying not to break character during his Oscar-winning performance as a concerned manager. They told me to finish cleaning out my workspace and collect my personal belongings while they watched like I was about to download state secrets. I was apparently such a dangerous criminal that I couldn't be trusted to pack my own coffee mug without adult supervision. They stood there monitoring my every move as I gathered my few personal items, probably expecting me to break down in tears or start begging for another chance. Instead, I just methodically collected my things while trying to process what had just happened. The shock was starting to wear off, and the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. I had been completely outplayed by people I had genuinely respected and trusted. These were the same managers who had praised my work ethic and performance reviews and relied on my competence to solve problems they couldn't handle themselves. Now, they were treating me like I was some kind of corporate criminal who had betrayed their trust and violated their sacred policies. The disconnect between their previous appreciation and their current hostility was so jarring that I kept waiting for someone to tell me this was all an elaborate joke. I had two choices in that moment. I could fight back immediately, demand to speak with HR, insist on reviewing the company handbook, or request a meeting with upper management to contest their decision. Or I could take the high road, maintain my dignity, and handle this situation with the same professionalism I had always demonstrated. Something told me that arguing with them right then would be pointless, since they had clearly already made up their minds about the outcome they wanted. Fighting would just give them more ammunition to use against me and probably wouldn't change their decision anyway. They were obviously expecting me to slink away, defeated, like some kind of wounded animal retreating to lick its wounds in private. The way they were looking at me suggested they thought this would be the end of the story. I would quietly disappear from their workplace, maybe complain to a few friends about unfair treatment, and eventually move on to another job, where I would hopefully learn my lesson about not being so dedicated to my work. They seemed to believe that firing me would solve all their problems and eliminate the threat I apparently posed to their comfortable mediocrity. The awkward aftermath was almost worse than the actual termination meeting. I had to walk through the office carrying my box of personal belongings, while my coworkers watched with confused expressions. Some of them approached me quietly to ask what was happening, but I just told them I was no longer going to be working there and wished them well in their future endeavors. I didn't want to create drama or put anyone in an uncomfortable position by sharing details about what had just occurred. My goal was to exit as gracefully as possible while preserving my professional reputation. My coworkers were genuinely shocked by the news. Several of them followed me out to the parking lot to express their disbelief and anger about the situation. They told me they couldn't understand why anyone would want to fire the most reliable and hardworking person in the department. Some of them mentioned that they had noticed the managers acting strangely around me recently, but hadn't understood what was happening until now. A few people offered to serve as references for future job applications and promised to put in good words for me with their contacts at other companies. Meanwhile, back inside the office, our 3 amateur detectives were probably celebrating their victory like they had just solved the crime of the century. They had successfully eliminated their biggest threat and proved their superior management skills by removing someone who made them look incompetent by comparison. Captain Incompetence was probably feeling vindicated after months of being shown up by someone who actually knew how to do their job effectively. The ego was likely basking in the glow of having exercised her authority in such a decisive manner. Professor Chaos was probably congratulating himself on executing such a brilliant strategy. They seemed to believe that firing me would be the end of their problems rather than the beginning of much bigger ones. In their minds, they had won the war by eliminating their enemy through superior tactical planning. They had outmaneuvered someone who was too naive to see their scheme coming and too trusting to fight back effectively. Their assumption was that I would simply disappear quietly and they could return to their comfortable routine of minimal effort and maximum drama without anyone around to highlight their various shortcomings. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me as I drove home with my box of belongings in the passenger seat. The more I thought about their behavior over the past few months, the more obvious it became that this had been planned well in advance. Their sudden interest in nitpicking my work, their mysterious meetings, their increasingly obvious attempts to create problems where none existed, it all made sense now as part of a larger strategy to build a case against me. What they didn't know was that I had accidentally recorded their entire termination meeting. That voice memo I had forgotten to stop was still running in my pocket, capturing every word of their grammatically challenged accusations and their refusal to listen to reasonable explanations. As I sat in my driveway, staring at that recording on my phone, I realized I had something they probably didn't expect me to have. Evidence. Real, actual proof of what had really happened in that conference room. I had no idea what to do with it yet, but something told me this recording was going to be important. They thought they had written the final chapter of this story, but they had no idea I was holding the pen. The universe loads its Slingshot. Within hours of being fired, I was documenting everything. Every conversation, every meeting, every weird interaction from the past few months got written down in painful detail. I wasn't planning some elaborate revenge scheme. I was just trying to protect myself because something about their whole performance felt wrong. The way they had refused to listen to any reasonable explanation, their complete dismissal of obvious solutions, and their theatrical presentation of evidence that barely qualified as circumstantial made me think I might need proof of what actually happened. The job search was brutal. Every application required me to explain why I was no longer employed at my previous position. I had to figure out how to tell potential employers that I had been fired for theft without actually admitting to stealing anything, which is basically an impossible conversation to have successfully. Most hiring managers would hear the word theft and immediately move on to the next candidate before I could explain the circumstances. After 3 weeks of rejections, I finally got called in for an interview at a company that seemed genuinely interested in my qualifications. The hiring manager was professional but thorough, asking detailed questions about my work history. When we got to the inevitable question about why I left my previous job, I gave him my standard explanation. He listened without interrupting, then told me something that made my stomach drop. He said he had already contacted my previous employer as part of their standard reference check process. Harvey had told him that I was fired for theft and that I was not eligible for rehire under any circumstances. They weren't just refusing to give me a positive reference. They were actively sabotaging my job prospects by spreading their version of events to anyone who called. The hiring manager asked if I had any additional information that might help him understand the situation better. I had been carrying around a copy of the documentation I had put together, mostly because I was paranoid about needing it someday. I pulled out the folder and started explaining the timeline of events leading up to my termination. I showed him my notes about the contradictory instructions, the mysterious meetings, and the increasingly obvious attempts to create problems where none existed. He read through everything carefully, asking questions about specific incidents. Then I mentioned that I had actually recorded the termination meeting because something about their behavior had seemed suspicious. His eyebrows went up when I said this, and he asked if I would be willing to let him listen to it. I played the recording on my phone, and we both sat there listening to Captain Incompetence, the ego, and Professor Chaos essentially admitting that they had set me up. You could hear them talking about how they had been planning this for weeks and how satisfied they were with the outcome of their scheme. The change in his demeanor was immediate and dramatic. He went from being politely skeptical to genuinely angry about what he was hearing. About halfway through the recording, he stopped it and said he recognized Harvey's voice from previous business dealings. That recognition seemed to make everything click for him in a way that transformed his entire understanding of the situation. He asked me to send him a copy of the recording and all my documentation, then told me he needed to make some phone calls before we could continue. I figured this was his polite way of ending the meeting, so I thanked him for his time and started to leave. He stopped me at the door and told me not to go anywhere because he wanted to finish our conversation. 20 minutes later, he came back and offered me the job on the spot. He said that after hearing the evidence I had provided, he was confident that the previous employer's reference was completely unreliable. He also mentioned that he was planning to take some additional action based on what he had learned, but he didn't elaborate on what that might involve. I accepted the job offer immediately and started planning my transition into a new workplace. My main goal was to put this whole experience behind me and get back to doing the kind of work I actually enjoyed. I had no idea that sharing my documentation and recording with this hiring manager was about to set off a chain reaction that would make my previous termination look like a minor workplace disagreement. I thought I was just trying to clear my name so I could get hired somewhere else. The irony of the whole situation was that I was desperately trying to move on with my life while accidentally lighting the fuse on the biggest corporate explosion my former workplace had ever experienced. I was focused on finding a new job and rebuilding my professional reputation, completely unaware that I had just handed someone the ammunition they needed to completely destroy the people who had wronged me. Sometimes the best revenge really is just telling the truth to the right person and letting them decide what to do with that information. What I didn't realize was that my new manager wasn't just going to file my recording away and forget about it. He had connections, resources, and apparently a very strong sense of justice when it came to workplace misconduct. The simple email attachment I had sent him was about to become the first domino in a collapse that would reshape everything. The domino effect begins. My new boss had sent the recording to corporate headquarters with a polite note explaining that he thought they might want to know about some questionable management practices at one of their locations. What he sent was essentially a small complaint about unfair treatment. What arrived at corporate headquarters was audio evidence of 3 managers openly admitting they had framed an employee and were celebrating their successful scheme. The corporate response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours of receiving that email, they dispatched Audrey, an internal investigator who specialized in workplace misconduct cases. She showed up at the restaurant unannounced on a Tuesday morning, expecting to spend maybe half a day reviewing some paperwork and interviewing a few people about a questionable termination. Instead, she walked into what would become the most complicated investigation of her career. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, our 3 criminal masterminds were still basking in the glow of their perceived victory. They had successfully eliminated their biggest threat and assumed that life would return to normal now that I was out of the picture. Their confidence started cracking the moment Audrey introduced herself and explained why she was there. The 3 of them went from celebrating conquerors to nervous defendants in the span of about 30 seconds. Captain Incompetence immediately started backtracking on statements he had made in the recording, claiming that his words had been taken out of context. The ego began insisting that the entire situation had been a misunderstanding and that they had followed proper procedures throughout the termination process. Professor Chaos tried to suggest that I had somehow manipulated the audio to make them sound bad. Audrey was not impressed by their explanations. She had listened to the recording multiple times and could clearly hear them admitting that they had planned the setup for weeks. She could hear them discussing how satisfied they were with the outcome of their scheme. She could hear them laughing about how I had walked right into their trap. Their attempts to reframe their own recorded words as innocent commentary were about as convincing as someone trying to explain away bank robbery footage by claiming they were making a withdrawal. The investigation was supposed to focus on my wrongful termination, but Audrey quickly realized there were bigger problems lurking beneath the surface. When she started interviewing other employees about the workplace environment, people began sharing stories that had nothing to do with my situation. The female servers told her about inappropriate comments and unwanted advances from management. The kitchen staff mentioned suspicious hiring practices and questionable documentation. The bartenders described a pattern of favoritism and retaliation that went back years. Our amateur detective squad tried desperately to control the narrative by offering my former department a small pay raise in exchange for backing up their version of events. They approached each person individually and suggested that they could make some positive changes to working conditions if everyone was willing to support management during this difficult time. What they were really asking for was help fabricating a story about my supposed incompetence that would justify my termination and make the whole investigation go away. This strategy backfired so spectacularly that it probably violated several laws of physics. Instead of gaining allies who would lie for them, they created a group of witnesses who could testify about their attempts to manufacture false evidence. Every person they approached immediately reported the conversation to Audrey, who added witness tampering and evidence fabrication to her growing list of concerns about their management practices. They had essentially handed her additional proof of their misconduct while trying to cover up their original misconduct. The pressure of the investigation caused them to start making increasingly desperate decisions. Captain Incompetence began contradicting his own previous statements every time he spoke with Audrey. The ego started producing documents that nobody had seen before, claiming they proved her side of the story. Professor Chaos kept changing his account of events, apparently hoping that if he told enough different versions, one of them would eventually sound believable. Each attempt to fix their story created new problems that required additional lies to explain. When Captain Incompetence claimed he had documented my performance issues, Audrey asked to see the documentation. When he produced obviously fabricated write-ups with suspicious dates, she wanted to know why these issues had never been reported to HR. When the ego insisted that my termination had been discussed with upper management, Audrey contacted upper management and discovered that no such discussions had taken place. The beautiful irony was that their original frame job had been so sloppy that it exposed a much larger pattern of corruption and misconduct. If they had just fired me for some generic reason like budget cuts or performance issues, the investigation might have ended after a few interviews. Instead, their elaborate scheme to frame me for theft had created a paper trail that led Audrey straight to years of questionable management practices. Within 2 weeks, what started as a simple inquiry about wrongful termination had expanded into a comprehensive audit of the entire operation. Audrey was no longer just investigating my firing. She was looking into hiring practices, payroll irregularities, workplace harassment, document fraud, and potential immigration violations. The 3 managers who thought they were solving a problem by getting rid of me had accidentally opened the door to the most thorough investigation their workplace had ever experienced. Their small lie about stolen food had become the loose thread that unraveled their entire carefully constructed web of workplace corruption. They went from being the hunters to being the hunted faster than you could say wrongful termination lawsuit. But the real entertainment was just beginning, because nothing destroys a criminal conspiracy quite like the criminals themselves, when idiots attack each other. The pressure from Audrey's investigation hit our 3 amateur villains like a freight train carrying a cargo of reality checks. What had started as their triumphant alliance against me quickly turned into something that belonged on a daytime soap opera. Captain Incompetence, the ego, and Professor Chaos went from being partners in crime to bitter enemies faster than you could say workplace misconduct investigation. Their beautiful friendship crumbled under pressure like a house of cards in a windstorm, except the cards were made of lies and the windstorm was an actual professional investigator who knew what she was doing. The first crack in their alliance appeared when Audrey started asking specific questions about who had initiated the plan to frame me. Each of them suddenly developed selective memory about their role in the scheme, claiming they had been reluctant participants who were just following orders from the other 2. Their attempts to distance themselves from the conspiracy were hilarious to watch because Audrey had the recording of their termination meeting where all three of them were clearly celebrating their successful scheme. She would play back specific sections where they were congratulating each other on their tactical brilliance, then ask them to explain how their current version of events aligned with their recorded statements. The situation escalated dramatically when their personal animosity spilled over into the public sphere. Professor Chaos posted a picture of himself on the company Facebook page, probably thinking this was just normal social media activity. Harvey saw this as an opportunity to take a passive-aggressive shot at his former ally by leaving a comment that seemed innocent on the surface, but was clearly intended to stir up trouble. What happened next was the corporate equivalent of watching two toddlers have a public meltdown in the middle of a grocery store. The Facebook exchange quickly devolved into a series of increasingly personal attacks that exposed secrets they definitely should have kept to themselves. Harvey made some snide comment about Professor Chaos's personal life that hinted at misconduct beyond their workplace scheming. Professor Chaos fired back with accusations about Harvey's inappropriate behavior with female employees, mentioning his attempts to be a sugar daddy to the waitresses. Within hours, their public argument had turned into a comprehensive catalog of each other's professional and personal failures, complete with specific details that read like a prosecutor's dream evidence list. The beautiful irony was that they were having this fight on the company's official Facebook page, where everyone could see it, including Audrey, who was still actively investigating their workplace. They were essentially providing her with a real-time confession about misconduct she hadn't even discovered yet. Every accusation they hurled at each other became a new lead for her to investigate. Every personal attack they made revealed another policy violation or potential crime that needed to be examined. The ego tried to stay above the fray initially, probably thinking she could maintain her dignity while her two former partners destroyed each other publicly. But she quickly got dragged into the mess when both men started mentioning her involvement in various schemes and cover-ups. Soon she was defending herself on social media like she was running for political office instead of trying to keep her management position at a mid-level corporate restaurant. Her attempts to appear professional while engaging in a public mudslinging contest were about as successful as trying to maintain your composure while your house is burning down around you. Their public fight revealed a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond framing one employee for theft. Harvey had apparently been making inappropriate advances toward female servers for years, offering to be their sugar daddy in exchange for personal favors. Professor Chaos had been involved in some kind of elaborate scheme involving fake identification documents that sounded like it belonged in a crime novel rather than a workplace investigation. The ego had been covering up various violations and helping to create false documentation to protect her colleagues from scrutiny. Each revelation led to bigger revelations as they tried to one-up each other with increasingly damaging accusations. They were like competing contestants on a game show, where the goal was to see who could confess to the most serious crimes while trying to make the other players look worse. Their attempt to save themselves by throwing each other under the bus had turned into a demolition derby, where everyone was guaranteed to crash and burn spectacularly. Audrey was probably sitting at her desk reading their Facebook fight with the same expression you might have while watching amateur comedians accidentally set themselves on fire during their performance. She didn't need to dig for evidence anymore because they were voluntarily providing her with detailed confessions about years of workplace misconduct. Their public meltdown had essentially created a roadmap that led directly to every skeleton in their corporate closet. Their social media warfare lasted for days, with each new post revealing additional layers of corruption and misconduct that had been festering in their workplace for years. What started as a simple disagreement about who was responsible for framing me had evolved into a comprehensive expose of systematic workplace abuse, document fraud, immigration violations, and sexual harassment. They had essentially conducted their own internal investigation and published the results for everyone to see, including federal investigators who were about to become very interested in their activities. But Harvey's public confession about his inappropriate behavior with female employees was about to open a door that had been sealed shut for years. The moment Audrey started interviewing the women who worked at the restaurant, stories began pouring out that made my termination look like a minor workplace disagreement. What started as an investigation into wrongful firing had suddenly become a comprehensive examination of systematic workplace harassment that had been festering under the surface for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The female servers and bartenders have been dealing with Harvey's disgusting behavior for years without feeling safe enough to report it. When Audrey sat down with them individually, they described a pattern of sexual harassment that was so blatant it belonged in a workplace training video about what not to do. One server told her how Harvey would pull her aside after closing, promising a sugar daddy deal if she would send him photos or stay late for activities that had nothing to do with restaurant operations. The fact that this had been going on for years, while management either ignored it or actively participated in covering it up, was a liability nightmare that kept getting worse with every interview. Each conversation Audrey had with female employees revealed new layers of misconduct that painted a picture of a workplace where harassment was not just tolerated, but practically encouraged by management. The women described feeling trapped because they needed their jobs, but were constantly subjected to unwanted advances and inappropriate comments from the people who controlled their schedules and their income. They had learned to navigate around Harvey's behavior like it was just another job requirement, which highlighted how completely the management had failed in their basic responsibility to provide a safe working environment. The investigation revealed that Harvey had a documented history of domestic abuse that somehow never came up during his hiring process. Corporate had apparently Googled their incoming general manager and found his mug shot on a domestic abuse report. But this information never prevented him from being placed in a position of authority over vulnerable employees. Instead, the company had given him the keys to the kingdom and then acted surprised when he used his position to prey on the people under his supervision. The fact that corporate headquarters had access to this background information but hired him anyway suggested either negligent decision-making or willful ignorance about the character of their management team. What made the situation even more absurd was that Harvey's inappropriate behavior was so obvious that other employees had been joking about it for years. His reputation for making unwanted advances was common knowledge among the staff, but somehow this information never made it up the chain of command to anyone who might have done something about it. The disconnect between what everyone knew was happening and what management claimed to know was happening created a liability situation that grew exponentially with each new revelation. The pattern of abuse that emerged from the investigation went far beyond simple workplace harassment. Harvey had been using his position to manipulate vulnerable employees in compromising situations, threatening their job security if they refused his advances, and creating a hostile work environment that affected everyone who worked there. The women who came forward described feeling powerless to stop his behavior because they knew that complaining would likely result in retaliation rather than resolution. Professor Chaos's involvement added another layer of criminal activity to the already toxic workplace environment. His side business creating fake identification documents for undocumented workers had been operating for years, right under the nose of corporate oversight. The line cook who had given me the leftover food was one of his customers, which meant that my termination had accidentally exposed an immigration fraud operation that had been generating illegal income from management while putting the company at risk for federal prosecution. The scope of the criminal enterprise that Audrey uncovered was staggering in its brazenness. Professor Chaos had been running what amounted to a document forgery business out of the restaurant, creating fake social security cards and identification documents for employees who couldn't work legally in the United States. This operation had been generating additional income for him, while creating massive legal liability for the company that employed him. The fact that this had been going on for at least 4 years without detection suggested either incompetent oversight or active participation from other members of management. Each new revelation made it clear that my firing for allegedly stealing leftover food was genuinely the least serious crime that had been committed in that workplace. The 3 managers who had orchestrated my termination had been covering up years of sexual harassment, document fraud, immigration violations, and systematic abuse of their positions. Their elaborate scheme to frame me for theft was almost quaint compared to the industrial-scale misconduct they had been engaging in on a daily basis. The company's liability grew exponentially as more victims came forward with their stories. Every woman who described Harvey's inappropriate behavior represented a potential lawsuit. Every employee who had been provided with fraudulent documents represented a federal crime. Every instance of retaliation against workers who had tried to report problems represented additional violations of employment law. What started as a simple wrongful termination case had evolved into a comprehensive catalog of corporate misconduct that would require teams of lawyers to sort out. The irony was that these managers had created detailed documentation of their own crimes through their arrogance and incompetence. Harvey's social media posts contained evidence of his inappropriate relationships with employees. Professor Chaos had kept records of his document forgery business that served as a complete confession to federal crimes. The Ego had created false performance reviews and disciplinary documents that proved systematic retaliation against employees who had tried to report problems. My firing had been intended to eliminate the one person who might have exposed their various schemes and cover-ups. Instead, it had created the exact conditions necessary for all their secrets to come to tumbling out at once. But what none of us realized was that Audrey's investigation had already attracted attention from people with much more serious badges and much more serious consequences in mind. The FBI joins the party. Federal agents arrived with the kind of timing that suggested the universe had a sense of dramatic irony. Audrey's tip-off led her to call federal agents once she uncovered Professor Chaos's fake identification mill, transforming what had been a corporate investigation into something that belonged on the evening news. Document fraud falls under federal jurisdiction because it involves violations of immigration law, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that cross state lines, which meant this case required people with badges that carried significantly more authority than corporate investigators. The transition from workplace harassment complaints to federal criminal case happened faster than anyone could have predicted. What started as Audrey reviewing personnel files, interviewing employees about inappropriate behavior suddenly became a multi-agency operation involving federal prosecutors and investigators who specialized in document fraud and immigration violations. The restaurant that had been dealing with routine HR problems was now the center of a criminal investigation that could result in federal prison sentences for multiple people. Professor Chaos had apparently been running his document forgery operation for years without considering that his customers might eventually become evidence in a federal case. He had been creating fake Social Security cards and identification documents for undocumented workers, charging them premium prices for documents that allowed them to work jobs they couldn't legally hold. This wasn't just a violation of immigration law, but a systematic fraud operation that had been generating thousands of dollars in illegal income while putting his employer at risk for massive federal penalties. The scope of his criminal enterprise was staggering when federal investigators started piecing together the full picture. He had been providing fraudulent documents to employees across multiple restaurant locations, creating a network of illegal workers who were being paid below minimum wage because they couldn't complain about their treatment without risking deportation. The federal authorities discovered that his operation had been supplying fake documents to dozens of people over several years, making this a major criminal conspiracy rather than a simple case of document fraud. The beautiful irony was that Professor Chaos's downfall started with his decision to frame me for stealing leftover food. If he had just minded his own business and continued running his illegal document mill, he might have avoided federal attention for years. Instead, his participation in the scheme to get me fired had created the chain of events that led investigators directly to his criminal operation. His attempt to eliminate someone who might have accidentally discovered his activities had actually created the conditions that guaranteed his activities would be discovered. The federal investigation revealed that employees who thought they were safely working under fake identities suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of immigration enforcement. The people who had purchased documents from Professor Chaos weren't just facing termination from their jobs, but potential deportation from the country. His customer list became evidence in a federal case, and everyone whose name appeared on it became a target for investigation by multiple agencies. The restaurant management had no idea they were employing a criminal who was running a document forgery business out of their workplace. They thought they were dealing with a competent operations manager who helped them maintain adequate staffing levels. They had no clue that their staffing stability was being maintained through systematic violation of federal immigration and fraud laws. When federal investigators explained the scope of the criminal enterprise that had been operating under their noses, corporate executives probably needed medical attention for the shock. Captain Incompetence and the ego suddenly realized that their problems with harassment complaints and wrongful termination lawsuits were minor compared to being associated with a federal criminal investigation. They had been worried about losing their jobs and facing civil lawsuits, but now they were potentially looking at federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Their attempt to cover up their misconduct had evolved into actively impeding a federal investigation, which carried penalties that made their original problems seem like parking tickets. The FBI's investigation uncovered a level of criminal activity that shocked everyone involved, including the federal prosecutors who had seen plenty of workplace crime cases. This wasn't just one manager engaging in isolated misconduct, but a systematic operation that had been violating multiple federal laws simultaneously for years. The document fraud was connected to tax evasion, wage theft, immigration violations, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of federal prison time for the people involved. The federal investigation revealed that my termination had accidentally exposed the largest document fraud operation in the region. Professor Chaos had been supplying fake identification documents to undocumented workers across multiple industries, creating a criminal network that extended far beyond the restaurant where I had been employed. His operation had been so successful that he had expanded into providing documents for people in construction, hospitality, and service industries throughout the metropolitan area. The charges that federal prosecutors eventually filed read like a comprehensive catalog of white-collar crime. Document fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion, money laundering, and immigration violations were just the beginning of a case that would require teams of federal attorneys to prosecute effectively. The penalties for these crimes could result in decades of federal prison time, massive financial penalties, and permanent deportation for the people involved. The most absurd part of the entire situation was that this massive federal investigation started because 3 incompetent managers decided to frame someone for taking home leftover sandwiches. Their petty scheme to eliminate an employee who made them look bad had accidentally triggered the most comprehensive federal investigation their industry had ever experienced. They had transformed a simple workplace dispute into a federal case that would reshape multiple lives forever. When the dust finally settled and all the investigations concluded, the final accounting of consequences would read like something crafted by a particularly creative force of justice. The beautiful chaos of justice. The consequences rolled out with mathematical precision. Captain Incompetence lost everything that mattered to him when his wife discovered his attempts to proposition female employees through his own Facebook posts during his public meltdown. The divorce papers were filed within weeks of his termination, and she took him for everything he was worth in the settlement. The man who thought he was some kind of corporate Romeo ended up alone, unemployed, and broke. The ego faced industry blacklisting when investigators discovered years of falsified performance reviews and fabricated disciplinary documents. The company made sure that every future employer would know exactly why she was terminated, destroying her reputation completely. Professor Chaos got federal charges including document fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and immigration violations that carried potential sentences measured in decades. The FBI arrested him at his home in front of his neighbors, and the local news stations covered his perp walk like he was some kind of organized crime boss. The line cook, who had given me the leftover food, got caught up in the immigration sweep that followed, leading to his deportation within months, along with several other employees who had been working under fraudulent identities. The general manager who had backed up their version of events when my new employer called for references got fired when corporate headquarters discovered he had been aware of the harassment, document fraud, but chose to ignore it. His termination triggered a clause in his employment contract that voided his severance package and his pension benefits. He lost his job, his retirement security, and his marriage, all because he decided to participate in covering up crimes he should have reported. The corporate entity that owned the restaurant had to conduct a complete management overhaul that extended far beyond the original location. The investigation revealed that similar problems existed at other restaurants in their chain, leading to firings and restructuring across multiple locations. They spent millions of dollars on the legal fees, settlement payments, and the cost of completely rebuilding their management structure. The company that thought they were just dealing with a routine personnel matter ended up facing federal scrutiny and public relations disasters that affected their entire operation. The restaurant itself went through changes that were so dramatic it was barely recognizable as the same workplace. Every single manager who had been involved in my termination or the subsequent cover-up was gone. The entire kitchen staff had to be replaced after the immigration violations were discovered. New policies and oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar problems in the future. The toxic workplace culture that had allowed harassment and criminal activity to flourish for years was completely dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. The most satisfying part of watching this unfold was realizing that their plan to get rid of me had accomplished the exact opposite of what they intended. They wanted to eliminate someone who might expose their various schemes and questionable practices. Instead, they created the precise conditions that guaranteed all their secrets would be exposed in the most public and damaging way possible. Their attempt to protect themselves from accountability had resulted in the most comprehensive accountability they could have imagined. I went from being the person they thought was their biggest threat to being completely irrelevant to their problems. They had spent so much time and energy plotting against me that they never noticed they were creating evidence of their own crimes. My termination became the least significant part of a story that involved federal investigations, criminal prosecutions, and corporate restructuring. The person they fired for allegedly stealing leftover food had accidentally triggered the exposure of crimes that made food theft look like a parking violation. The irony was so perfect, it felt like fiction. They tried to frame someone for stealing food and ended up exposing document fraud, sexual harassment, immigration violations, and systematic workplace abuse. They tried to get rid of their most competent employee and ended up losing their most corrupt managers. They tried to protect their jobs and ended up creating the conditions that would cost them everything they had worked to build. Looking back at the entire chain of events, I'm amazed that my simple decision to record our termination meeting and document their behavior had such far-reaching consequences. I was just trying to protect myself from false accusations, but I accidentally lit the fuse on the biggest workplace explosion any of us had ever witnessed. The beautiful thing about the whole situation was how little I actually had to do to make any of it happen. I just documented what was happening and told the truth when people asked me about it. Everything else was just their own actions creating consequences they never saw coming. The funniest part about this entire situation is that I never actually got revenge on anyone. I just told the truth to someone who was willing to listen and then watched while the universe handled the rest. Sometimes the best way to deal with people who try to destroy you is to just be yourself and let their own actions create the consequences they deserve. So here's my advice if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Document everything. Record conversations when possible. Keep detailed notes about suspicious behavior. Trust that justice has a way of finding people who think they can get away with anything. And remember that sometimes the most spectacular revenge is just being honest while watching dishonest people destroy themselves. If you've got your own stories of workplace injustice or corporate chaos, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear how karma caught up with the people who tried to mess with you. Maybe I was too much of a golden retriever employee for my own good, but at least I got the best seat in the house for the most epic workplace meltdown in corporate history.